Robb Stark sat in his tent, staring at the map of Westeros spread across the wooden table. His war council had disbanded for the night, and the candlelight flickered, casting long shadows on his face. He was exhausted, both in body and spirit, but there was no room for weakness. The king in the north could not afford to falter. The war against the Lannisters had taken its toll, but it was far from lost. His victories at Oxcross and in the Riverlands had proven his strength as a commander, yet the loss of Winterfell too. Theon Greyjoy weighed heavily on his mind. He had made a mistake, trusting Theon, but the war didn't allow him the luxury of regret. His mother, Catelyn Stark, had made her own blunder by freeing Jaime Lannister in a desperate bid to exchange him for Sansa and Arya. That decision had caused division among his bannermen, particularly Lord Karstark. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the choice that stood before him, to honour his word to Walder Frey or to let his heart guide him toward Lady Talisa Maega, the woman he had already married in secret. Robb clenched his jaw as he remembered his mother's words. She had pleaded with him not to break his oath to Lord Frey. Honour had cost his father his life, and now Robb's own honour, or lack of it, threatened to destroy his campaign. Walder Frey had made his expectations clear. If Robb married one of his daughters, the Freys would stand by the Starks. If not, House Frey would turn against them, and the consequences would be dire. Talisa was asleep in the tent behind him. He loved her, but love was a weakness in war. That night, as the candle burned low, Robb Stark made his decision. The next morning he rode to the twins, alone save for his closest bannerman and his mother. The air was thick with tension as they crossed the river, approaching the castle of the ever-resentful Walder Frey. The Lord of the Crossing greeted them with his usual sneer, his eyes narrowing at Robb as if waiting for the king in the north to make another misstep. "I see you've decided to grace us with your presence after all, your grace," Frey said, the sarcasm in his voice unmistakable. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten your oaths. But I am an old man, and I forget things myself. What was it you promised me again?" Robb did not rise to the bait. He knelt before the Lord of the Crossing and spoke in a steady voice. "I swore to marry one of your daughters, Lord Frey, and I am here to keep my word." For the first time that day, Walder Frey's expression changed. He had expected Robbie to defy him. He had expected to be insulted. Instead, he was getting exactly what he had demanded. The wedding was arranged quickly. Though Robb's heart ached for Talisa, he had already made his choice. The marriage was political, nothing more, and his new wife, Roslyn Frey, was innocent in all of this. She was a kind girl, soft-spoken and graceful, far different from the image he had conjured in his mind when thinking of the Frey women. The ceremony was simple, and the Freys were satisfied. More importantly, Robb's army remained intact. The North and the Riverlands were united with the Freys under one cause, to defeat the Lannisters. Had he followed his heart and defied Walder Frey, the Red Wedding would have awaited him. But now fate had taken a different path. With the Freys at his side, Robb Stark rode toward the war that would define the future of Westeros. Robb Stark and his army left the twins behind, the banners of House Stark, Tully, and Frey flying together for the first time. The Freys had been secured as allies, but Robb knew better than to trust Walder Frey's loyalty. The old man had given his daughter, Roslin, as Robb's wife, but there was no love lost between them. Roslin had been kind, soft-spoken, and visibly terrified throughout the ceremony. Unlike her father, she seemed to have no malice in her, and that was a small mercy. But Robb could not afford to dwell on his marriage. He had a war to win. As they rode, his commanders gathered around him. Lord Roose Bolton, always unreadable, with his cold eyes and measured words, rode beside him. Lord Edmure Tully, his uncle, seemed more at ease now that the Frey alliance had been restored. Lord Rickard Karstark, still bitter over the loss of his sons at Jaime Lannister's hands, remained silent, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "We must move swiftly," Roose Bolton advised, his voice calm. "Tywin Lannister will not sit idle while we regroup. If we strike at Harrenhal now, we may gain the advantage before he has time to act." "Harrenhal is of little use to us," Edmure argued. "It's a ruin, and Tywin has already left it." "Behind. King's Landing is the prize we should be after." "We cannot march on King's Landing alone," Robb said, his voice firm. "We do not have the numbers. Even with the Freys, we need more men." Lord Karstark finally spoke. "Then why are we wasting time? The Ironborn hold Winterfell. The Greyjoys betrayed us, and we let them." His voice dripped with bitterness. "We should take back our home." Robb clenched his jaw. He wanted nothing more than to free Winterfell from Theon's grasp, but he knew the realities of war. If he turned north now, the Lannisters would regain the Riverlands. His people would suffer for it. "The North will wait," Robb said, though the words felt like a knife in his heart. "We must win this war before we can reclaim our home." Karstark said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. As the days passed, Robb's army moved south, striking at Lannister supply lines and harassing their forces. With the Freys on their side, they had the numbers to threaten Riverrun, pushing the Lannisters back. News arrived that Stannis Baratheon had been defeated. At Blackwater, his fleet burned and his men scattered. Tywin Lannister had saved King's Landing, but at great cost. Robb saw an opportunity. "If Stannis is broken," he told his council, "then the Lannisters have lost their greatest enemy in the south, but they will turn their attention fully to us now. We must act before they can recover." Roose Bolton, ever the strategist, nodded. "We should take the fight to the west. The Lannisters' wealth comes from Casterly Rock. If we strike there, we wound them at their heart." It was a bold move, one that even Edmure seemed hesitant about. But Robb saw the sense in it. The Lannisters had never faced a direct attack on their ancestral home. If he could take Casterly Rock, the war might turn in his favor. He sent envoys to the Iron Bank of Braavos, seeking financial support. He also sent messages to Dorne, hoping to stir the Martells against the Lannisters. Yet while Robb planned his next move, shadows grew within his own camp. Lord Karstark's resentment festered. He had lost 2 sons in this war, and still Robb had done nothing to avenge them. Then came the breaking point. Karstark's men, seeking vengeance, murdered 2 young Lannister prisoners held in the Stark camp. When Robb heard the news, his blood ran cold. This act of treachery had jeopardized their cause. He gathered his men, standing before them as he passed judgment on Lord Karstark. The old lord, defiant to the end, did not beg for mercy. "You've weakened us," Robb told him. "Your vengeance cost us honor, and honor is all we have left. Honor won't win you this war, boy. Karstark sneered. "But killing me will cost you half your army." Robb did not hesitate. He swung his sword, ice, clean through Karstark's neck. The old man's head rolled to the ground, and the camp fell silent. True to Karstark's words, many of his men abandoned Robb that night. The king in the north had won a battle of honor, but at what cost? Robb Stark watched as the Karstark men rode away into the night, their torches flickering like distant stars in the darkness. He had known this would happen, yet the weight of his decision settled heavily on his shoulders. He had lost nearly half his cavalry, and now his army was weaker than ever. Catelyn Stark stood near the entrance of his tent, her face etched with sorrow. "You did what you thought was right," she said, her voice soft. Robb shook his head. "What I thought was right may have just doomed us." His mother hesitated before stepping closer. "You have lost men, but you still have loyal ones. The Freys, the Tullys, and the Boltons remain with us." The mention of the Boltons made Robb uneasy. Rose Bolton had been quiet since Karstark's execution, but there was something about him that made Robb wary. The man was calculating, unpredictable. He had suggested taking Harrenhal earlier, and now he held the fortress in Robb's name. "We must move quickly," Robb finally said. "If we hesitate, Tywin Lannister will use this moment of weakness against us." His decision was made. They would march west and strike at the Lannister heartland. The march to Casterly Rock was grueling. Robb's forces moved swiftly through the Riverlands, avoiding direct confrontation with any remaining Lannister forces. Walder Frey's men, led by his sons, proved themselves useful in scouting and clearing supply routes. Yet Robb did not trust them. Their loyalty was tied to Walder Frey's whims, and he had no illusions that the old man would turn on him if given the right incentive. When they reached the western lands, Robb ordered his forces to split. Rose Bolton and his men were to continue securing Harrenhal and reinforcing their positions in the Riverlands. Meanwhile, Robb and the main force would march directly toward Casterly Rock. As they neared their target, word arrived from the south, Ballany. Greyjoy was dead. The Iron Islands had fallen into chaos as his brother and daughter, Yara Greyjoy, fought for control. With the Ironborn weakened, Theon's hold on Winterfell was vulnerable. But Robb knew he could not spare men for the north just yet. "We take Casterly Rock first," he told his commanders. "Then we take back Winterfell." The Lannisters had never expected an attack on their ancestral home. Tywin Lannister had taken most of his forces to King's Landing, leaving the rock lightly defended. Robb's army overwhelmed the city, cutting down the few Lannister soldiers who remained. Within days, the fortress was his. For the first time in the war, Robb Stark had struck a decisive blow. The richest stronghold in Westeros was now under Stark control. But the victory was short-lived. News arrived from the Riverlands. Rose Bolton had abandoned his position at Harrenhal. Worse, Walder Frey had secretly opened negotiations with the Lannisters. Robb felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the betrayal was already in motion. His army had been split too thin, his enemies were regrouping, and in the shadows the wolves were being surrounded. Robb Stark stood atop the walls of Casterly Rock, looking down at the city below. The banners of House Stark flew alongside the Tully and Frey sigils, but he knew the alliance was fragile. The Lannisters had been caught off guard, and their home had fallen, But this was not the end. Tywin Lannister was still alive, and that meant the war was far from over. A cold wind blew through the castle, carrying with it the scent of the sea. His mind was clouded with unease. The victory had been swift, too swift. He should have felt triumphant, but all he could think about was Roose Bolton's disappearance and the whispered rumours of Walder Frey's secret dealings. "We should prepare for a counter-attack," said Edmure Tully, standing beside him. "Tywin will not let this stand. He'll come with everything he has." "He doesn't have much left," Robb countered. "He lost many men in the Riverlands, and Stannis weakened him at Blackwater. His forces are stretched thin." Edmure shook his head. "That may be true, but Tywin Lannister doesn't need numbers. He needs only one good scheme." And that was what worried Robb the most. That night, as he sat in the Lord's chambers of Casterly Rock, his wife, Roslyn Frey, entered the room hesitantly. She was still a stranger to him. She had been nothing but gentle and kind since their marriage, yet he could not bring himself to trust her. "My lord," she said softly, "there is something you should know." Robb turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" She lowered her voice. "I received a letter from my father. He speaks of peace, of bringing the war to an end. He asks that you return to the Twins for a gathering of the lords. He says he will pledge more men to your cause." Robb narrowed his eyes. "And what do you think?" Roslyn hesitated before meeting his gaze. "I think you should not go. My father does not forgive easily. He may smile in front of you, but he holds grudges." Robb felt a chill run down his spine. His mother had warned him never to trust Walder Frey completely, and now even his Frey wife was telling him the same. "Send a reply," he said. "Tell him I will consider his offer, but I will not leave the West unguarded." Roslyn nodded, relief washing over her face. Days passed, and more troubling news arrived. Roose Bolton had resurfaced, not as Robb's ally, but as Warden of the North, appointed by the Lannisters. Robb's breath caught in his throat as he read the message. Bolton had betrayed him. His mind raced. The Karstarks were gone, the Boltons had turned, and the Freys were scheming in the shadows. His army was victorious but isolated. The wolves were being surrounded. "We march for the north," Robb declared to his commanders. "Winterfell must be reclaimed, and the traitors dealt with." But as the banners were gathered, and the army prepared to leave, a new force appeared on the horizon, Lannister banners marching toward them. Tywin had come. The war was not over. It was only just beginning. The Lannister banners stretched across the horizon, a sea of crimson and gold under the burning western sun. Robb Stark stood on the battlements of Casterly Rock, his heart pounding as he watched the approaching army. Tywin Lannister had moved faster than expected. Robb had assumed the Lion of the Rock would take time to regroup after losing his ancestral seat, but Tywin was not a man who waited. He struck back with precision, with the same cold ruthlessness that had kept his house in power for generations. The War Council assembled quickly. Edmure Tully, Roose Bolton's former Lieutenant Locke, and several Frey commanders filled the chamber. Robb sat at the head of the table, his mind racing through strategies. "We're outnumbered," Edmure said bluntly, his expression grim. "Tywin has called every remaining Lannister loyalist to his side. We still hold the rock, but we don't have the men to hold it forever." Locke,
who had remained with Robb despite Bolton's betrayal, scoffed. "We took Casterly Rock with fewer men. We can hold it."
"Taking a fortress is easier than defending one when the enemy is prepared," Robb countered. "If we're trapped inside, we'll be surrounded, cut off from supplies, and we cannot expect reinforcements from the Riverlands now that Bolton has betrayed us." "Then we should ride out and face them in the field," suggested. "You've won every battle so far, Your Grace. Why start hiding now?" Robb considered it. His wolves had proven their strength on open ground before, but this was different. Tywin was not an arrogant fool like Jaime. He was calculating, patient, and above all, ruthless. If Robb rode out now, he risked falling into a carefully laid trap. But waiting inside the castle meant slow starvation, and Tywin knew it. Then there was the deeper issue. The Freys! Robb looked toward the Frey commanders in the room. Their faces were unreadable, but he knew they were waiting. Walder Frey had betrayed him once before, when he refused to send his troops after Robb had broken his oath. Now, with Tywin
knocking at their gates, could he really trust them to fight to the death for House Stark? "Where do your loyalties stand?" Robb asked, his voice calm but firm. The eldest Frey commander, Sir Ryman, hesitated for a fraction too long. "We are loyal."
To House Stark. Robb didn't believe him. That night, as his men reinforced the gates, he spoke privately with his mother. "You don't trust them," Catelyn observed, watching him as he paced the chamber. "Should I?" Robb asked bitterly. "The Freys sided with us only because I married Roslyn, but their true loyalty is to their own survival. I can see it in their eyes. If the battle turns, they will turn as well." Catelyn sighed. "Then don't give them the chance." Robb stopped pacing. "You mean—" "Strike first," she said, "before they can betray you. It was a bold move, a dangerous one, but in war hesitation meant death." That night, as the campfire smoke drifted into the cold air, Robb made his move. His most loyal men, including his personal guards, moved quietly through the castle. The Frey officers, still unsuspecting, were cut down in their beds. By dawn, only the Stark loyal Frey soldiers remained. The others were gone. Robb addressed his men before the coming battle. "The Freys would have betrayed us," he said, his voice
steady. "They would have opened the gates to the Lannisters the moment they thought the battle was lost. I will not suffer traitors in my army. We march out, we fight, and we take our victory."
The men roared in agreement. The gates of Casterly Rock opened, and the wolves of the north charged. The battlefield was chaos. Robb led his men from the front, his direwolf Grey Wind tearing through enemy ranks beside him. The Lannisters had expected a siege, not a direct attack. The sudden assault forced them to scramble, their formations breaking apart in the initial charge. But Tywin was no fool. He quickly regrouped, rallying his heavy cavalry to strike at Robb's flank. The battlefield became a bloodbath. Robb fought like a demon, his sword carving through enemy knights, but the tide began to turn. The Lannisters had the numbers, and slowly they pushed the Stark forces back. Then came the final blow. From the east another force appeared on the battlefield. Banners of House Frey flew in the wind, but they were not marching for Robb. Walder Frey had made his choice. He had betrayed Robb once more, this time openly siding with the Lannisters. The battle turned into a massacre. Edmure Tully was dragged from his horse, taken captive. Locke was killed in the retreat. Grey Wind, the mighty direwolf, fought fiercely, but was eventually cut down by Lannister archers. Robb himself was wounded, an arrow buried deep in his side. His men tried to protect him, but they were outnumbered. One by one they fell. He collapsed onto the blood-soaked ground, his vision blurring. In the distance, he saw Tywin Lannister watching from atop his horse, his expression unreadable. As Robb gasped for breath, his last thought was of Winterfell, of what could have been. The young wolf had fought bravely, but in the end, the Game of Thrones had claimed another Stark, and this time there was no red wedding, just a battlefield of dead wolves.